Let's concentrate now on building the tank car fleet. The best way to ship the gas before pipelines and trucks was by rail. The Amarillo plant was located on the Rock Island. The plants at Excel, Keys, Cunningham, and Navajo were located on the Santa Fe, and the one at Otis, Kansas was located on the Missouri Pacific. So obviously the Santa Fe got the lion's share of transportation of this valuable commodity. This graph shows shipments of helium tank cars from 1946 to 1992. An essential element that's not on this graph, of course, is the total shipment of helium by any source. What's not indicated here is that starting around 1968, most of the helium started being shipped by truck. So while this does not reflect the total shipments of helium, it shows what happened after the close of the lunar space program in the 1970s and the decline in rail shipments of helium. In-service shots of helium tank cars are extremely rare, and trying to find more and more pictures of them has been fun with this project. Here's an example. This shot was made in 1968 near Boise City, Oklahoma, with Santa Fe mixed train number 174. There were 8 generations of helium tank cars. 241 cars were built from 1926 to 1962. By far the majority of them were built by American Car and Foundry. 77 cars were built by General American Transportation. Magor built 35, Bethlehem Steel built 3, and the Darby Corporation of Kansas City, Kansas built 6 cars. The first 3 helium tank cars were large bottle tank cars, 1 for the U.S. Navy and 2 for the U.S. Army Air Service. The 3 cylinders were manufactured by Krupp Steel in Germany, shipped over, and mated to somewhat standard underframes at Bethlehem Steel. These cars were in service for quite a few years. This is the Army Air Service version. Here they are at Fort Worth in 1928. These were the helium cars used to transport helium for those big airships we talked about earlier. Notice the very high-tech unloading facility at Lakehurst, New Jersey. Here they are in 1931 being filled at the new plant in Amarillo. When helium is held inside a balloon for a period of time, it starts to get contaminated. The Army, at the time it was the U.S. Army Air Service, talked to the Bureau of Mines and said, "Look, we've got to do something about this problem." The Bureau scientists took some of the equipment that came out of the old Fort Worth helium plant, put it in a couple of rail cars, and devised a way they could drain the helium out of the observation balloon, or a Navy airship, cool it and compress it, vent the nitrogen to the outside, and return the pure helium back into the airship. This was what was done in these 2 cars. Here's some of the equipment in the car that cools and compresses the contaminated helium, removing the impurities and venting them to the outside. Pictured here at McCook Field in Ohio, which later became Dayton Army Airfield, these cars were assigned there. We have no evidence that they were ever moved, but then again we have no evidence that they were not moved. There's just very little record to support any movement of these cars from one spot to another. We do know, however, that the technology worked, and all of the naval air stations had a helium purification plant that was built on site, so they didn't have to have rail cars to do that. This particular locomotive was used in construction on the narrow gauge railroad in the building of the Panama Canal. After completion of the canal, the locomotives were turned back for use on military installations, where they were returned to standard gauge. This car did move at least once. Here it is found in Amarillo in 1930. Subsequent review of more aerial photographs indicates that it's not on a service track. It's just on a little piece of track sitting there. So it could very well have been just used as a construction office, but it remained there for several years. Let's move now to the cars you're probably a little more familiar with. This is the first set of modern helium tank cars built by General American in 1930. There were 24 tubes, and when I say tube or tank, I use the words interchangeably. They were all lettered for the United States Navy, USNX. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics had control over these cars. This is the manifold end of the car with these 2 big doors. The government went through many different versions of how this manifold looked, but essentially the gas came in here with a very small hose and filled up all of those individual tubes. Here's a nice birthday shot of one of them out in front of the cryogenic laboratory in Amarillo. That is a beautiful car. This picture shows just about the entire fleet at the Amarillo plant. All 3 of the 3 tank cars and several of the 28 tube cars. Somewhere between 1930, when they were built, and 1943, these cars were shopped for some modifications. Notice it now has an X brace in the center and 45-degree braces at both ends. The photograph was made in March 1943 when the first car of Helium shipped from the XL plant. And here she goes, headed out toward Amarillo. This batch of cars lasted quite a while. This photograph was made in Tracy, California in February 1957. It was formerly lettered USNX 1005 and still in service 27 years later. The next generation of cars came along in 1933. Tank fabrication and metal technology improved, so they were able to increase pressure to 3,000 pounds per square inch and get more product inside each tube. The tube's walls were 3/4 of an inch thick. I mentioned K cylinders earlier. An empty K cylinder weighs about 140 pounds. A K cylinder full of helium weighs about 143 pounds. So you have 140 pounds of tare weight that you're going to have to pay shipping charges on coming and going. Cylinders were a very inefficient, expensive way to ship large quantities of helium. So what they needed to do was have a tank or a series of freight cars that could hold it under high pressure. Because if helium is under high pressure, you can get a lot more of it in there. We're going to discuss that a little bit at the end of the program. This class of cars was almost a foot higher than the 28 tube cars. They were completely rebuilt by ACF in 1955. This photo shows the added X brace, and the end braces were moved over to make it a much more sturdy car. Though the reporting marks were changed to MHAX, I can almost guarantee you that the Navy did not renumber these cars. Most likely, this car was severely damaged in a wreck and shipped to ACF for rebuilding. The tanks became so valuable that at the end of the car's service life, people were bidding considerable amount of money to purchase them. When World War II began, they found they did not have enough cars, so the Navy and the Bureau of Mines entered into a contract with General American Transportation for 32 new tank cars, 1013 to 1078. They added a few more improvements in the construction and were built very quickly and sent out to the plants. Here's Santa Fe 1827 leaving XL with new car 1030, but look what's ahead of it. These are flat cars with containers on them, and they're marked U.S. Navy. What in the world are they? Nobody had ever seen anything like this before. We could find very little supporting data, but through a lot of hard work and conjecture, what we have deduced is they are cylinder container cars. Each one of these containers is 23 to 28 feet long, 4 feet by about 4.5 feet tall, and carries 100 K cylinders. They have lifting rings on top of them. Taking the date of the photo and the cars that are shown, we theorized what happened was this. The loaded cars were moved from the XL plant to the East Coast and up into Nova Scotia, where they were loaded onto convoy ships and taken to England in preparation for the invasion of Normandy. The cylinders of helium were used to fill barrage balloons, protecting the invasion, and also had protected London after the Battle of Britain. Here's another shot of the same train heading out with those container cars. Here are some photographs from FSA photographer Jack Delano's famous trip across the Santa Fe. These were made near Chillicothe, Illinois in 1943. The train must have parted, and the crew was able to put it back together fairly quickly. This is a birthday picture of one of the new Navy cars at GATC in Chicago. This series of cars were painted all battleship gray. The earlier series cars were painted in 2 colors. Superstructures were battleship gray. The tanks themselves were painted silver or aluminum. One of the most distinctive features of helium cars are the 100-ton capacity trucks. These are extremely heavy cars, on the order of 230,000 pounds. The cars have very thick axles, they have much bigger wheels, they have clasp brakes, meaning there's a brake shoe on the outside and on the inside, and they have heavy-duty frames. Here's a close-up shot of the wooden roof walk. This Navy car was just repainted at XL in 1951. She's all dressed up and ready to go. It's an excellent shot showing the B or brake end of the car. The Bureau of Mines tried different experiments with these cars, learning how to get more helium into the tanks in a more efficient way. There's no telling what the man in this picture was doing. Very few government photographs have dates, names, or anything else on them. At Amarillo around 1950, we see how the cars were loaded with helium. The end with the doors is the A end of the car. This is a photograph that came from deep within a military record that we discovered about Lehman Ridge, the Air Force Rocket Propulsion Test Center near Edwards Air Force Base. The test center was built around 1957, and this photograph shows a very early painted Jeep and a Navy helium car taking a load up for a rocket motor test. The Navy cars lasted a long time. Here's Warbaby 1018 just ahead of the tank car, photographed at XL in 1966. It was 1955 before the government bought any more helium cars. The space race and the development of our nation's nuclear program prompted it. Contracts were entered into with American Car and Foundry for 66 cars. Notice here how very obvious the silver tanks and the gray sides show up. It doesn't last long when the car gets out in the weather. It very quickly becomes very hard to discriminate these colors, especially in black and white photography. These cars are lettered for the Atomic Energy Commission, AT&SF. While they were owned by the AEC, it was mainly for bean counting purposes, because all cars in the fleet were in pool service. They could be consigned to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, or they could be consigned to Lakehurst, New Jersey, or wherever. It was pool helium, so the reporting marks were mainly for accounting purposes. About 6 to 12 cars were thus lettered. Here's ATMX 1004. Again, you can see that these tanks are silver and the outside superstructure is gray. Note the louvers on the end. This is an ACF end. It doesn't have as many louvers on it as GATC built cars did. The bracing gussets are a little bit different as well, but other than that, they're very similar cars, which will be helpful to us as we start to model them. In June 1955, the Navy bean counters evidently decided they didn't need these helium cars on their inventory. So let's give them to the Bureau of Mines and let them worry about it, the Navy said. Very quickly, all of the cars that were marked USNX were brought in, some paint was slapped over the Navy markings, and the reporting marks, MHAX, replaced USNX at that time. This was one of the biggest discoveries of my entire research. The rosters weren't adding up. We know who, rather we thought we knew who, built what. We knew exactly how many cars were built, but nothing was matching up. When we started going through all the car mechanical drawings at the National Archives in Fort Worth, we found a manufacturer had crept in that no one had ever heard of before, the Darby Corporation, out of Kansas City, Kansas. During the war, they built landing craft, LCTs. Mr. Darby was a U.S. Senator from Kansas City, Kansas, and somehow he found out the government needed more helium cars. They were all for the Atomic Energy Commission, by the way. Either ACF couldn't build them, or somebody owed Darby a favor, or he owed them a favor, or something. These 25 orphan cars were built by Darby's company. The only one that we know that is still around is the one at Amarillo at the Atomic Museum. More new cars were ordered as the space program accelerated and the Cold War escalated. These were delivered from 1959 to 1960 from ACF. If you notice, now we started to go with roller-bearing trucks. Prior to this, They were all standard solid bearing trucks, still with the outside clasp or the clasp brake. Here's a prime example of this batch in 1960 at XL. The cars were definitely painted in two colors, but it sure doesn't look like it. That's because it's been naturally weathered. By 1962, as I said, they'd given up on the two-color paint scheme. These cars were the last of the Mohicans. Built by Magor and ACF in 1961 and 1962, they were very similar. Notice how we've now lost the clasp brakes. All have roller bearings, and the car is painted entirely silver with black safety appliances. MHAX 1175 was part of the batch built by ACF. There are only subtle differences between the Magor and the ACF cars. And here is MHAX 1192 at XL in 1961. We'll touch for just a minute on the articulated cars that weren't. The government called them articulated cars. All the documentation we have says they were articulated. To me, an articulated car means something that's got a drawbar that's permanently coupled together. Well, they weren't. They had shelf couplers on them, which are these things. They had a little pin between them that they dropped in there to make them somewhat permanently coupled, so they were semi-articulated. To me, that's like either an occasional chair or an occasional table, When is it a table? When is it a chair? Anyway, that's what the government called them, and that was in 1985 at the very end of the line. They took 28 cars, most of them the Magor cars, and created 14 sets, naming them by a number followed by an A or a B. I also want to hit on these trucks again because they're so important to these cars. This is the early solid bearing truck. You can see this is an Andrews design. On the first 1930 version, 28 tubes to the car. See how big those journals are? They're bolted here. That gives you a good idea of what a clasp brake looks like. Here's another shot in the GATC plant showing how thick that axle is in relation to what you're normally used to. Now, this was a roller bearing truck, which was an ASF truck that would replace some of the earlier trucks at some point in time. I've now discovered that not all of these cars received roller bearing trucks. Some of them went to scrap with the solid bearing truck. But if they were in interchange service, they had to use roller bearings. A lot of these cars wound up just sitting on siding somewhere in the country and were used strictly as storage. They were not placed in interchange service. This accident photo shows a lot of detail. Look how large the frame is. And here's the reason that you have the clasp brakes. There are two complete brake systems on these cars, 2 air reservoirs, 2 actuating cylinders, and 2 triple valves, 1 for each truck. Another very prime modeling feature of these cars. Well, here's what the fleet looked like from 1938 until the end in 1997. See that magic date of June 1955 when the Navy cars were relettered to MHAX. The ATMX was added, and more cars joined the roster. You can see by January of 1968, they gave up on the ATMX, and everything was painted and renumbered back into MHAX. So where did these cars go? Well, here's just a quick example of what we've been able to locate. You have to determine what time frame you're modeling. What are you interested in? What railroads even existed at the time? Or what the traffic was. We know a lot of traffic went to Cape Canaveral. The cars left on the Santa Fe, eventually got there on the Florida East Coast. Between 63 and 73, it was called Cape Kennedy. Vandenberg Air Force Base in California was on the Southern Pacific. A lot of NASA, a lot of USAF rocket flights out of there. Langley, Virginia, NASA again. Bay St. Louis, Mississippi, NASA Space Center. Oak Ridge, Tennessee, Atomic Energy Commission. Batavia, Illinois, Atomic Energy Commission. The Navy, Lakehurst, New Jersey, possibly on the New York Central. We think most of this probably went to Chicago first and was handed off there. Weeksville, North Carolina on the Southern, Moffett Field, California on the SP. Anyway, this just gives you a rough idea of where those helium cars went, depending on the time and place. This concludes part 3. In the next part, we'll discuss modeling the helium tank cars, as well as a few closing thoughts. Please stay tuned. If you selected autoplay, part 4 will begin shortly.